Hello, everybody. So this is the first part of our asynchronous or pre-recorded lecture session covering our lecture on September 18th. So I know that I had sent you out those questions to answer on A Doll's House. As I took a look at some of the responses, I thought it would be a lot more engaging and useful to be able to cover some of that material in class instead. And there's actually a fair bit of material to get through just before we get to that point. And in order to keep these asynchronous lectures tight and focused, I think we're going to do that instead. So please have A Doll's House completely read and finished for our lecture on the 25th. You may also notice that I'm here at home. We have an open concept here at home. It is Sunday that I'm recording the first part of this lecture, and I've got a family. And so there may be some minor interruptions, in which case I will pause the video. So there may be some cuts like that. And if you hear any disruptions, like a dog barking, that's I guess the nature of delivering these things at home. So I'm going to pick up on some threads from our last session. So if you wanted to pause and to get out the document on Learn, where it talks about the plots and climax. And just as a referral, if you feel like you have a good understanding of that, you don't have to pause. But if you want to review that before I go into this, I just want to give you an example of I mentioned Macbeth, and I just kind of want to walk through that a little bit more. And so yeah, feel free to pause, go and grab that, and then come back. Okay, so you're back. Um, So we were talking about, I had mentioned exposition. So in the play Macbeth, right at the beginning, we learn that Macbeth and Banquo have just fought a brutal battle, and I think they defeated two different armies. And we found that we hear that Macbeth was particularly heroic. We learn that he is a general, that he is a great warrior, that he and Banquo are very good friends. So this is all exposition. And then they come upon some witches. So lots of spoiler alerts here if you haven't read Macbeth. And the witches tell Macbeth that he will be the Thane of Cawdor. He's not the Thane of Cawdor right now, he's the Thane of Glamis. And that he will eventually be the king. And of course, he's dumbfounded. He's like, I don't understand. They tell Banquo that his sons will beget kings, I think. Um, and so he's perplexed. This doesn't make any sense. How strange. Um, and also recognizes that they're strange. And so it's all bizarre to him. And then two guys come on and they tell him, "Hey, the king just sent me to let you know that you are the Thane of Cawdor." And so right away he realizes that, okay, these witches, these premonitions do have the ability to come true. They were just here, they're gone. I think they kind of like disappear. And so there's a supernatural element, and it's come to pass. So all of that is exposition. It's also it becomes a part of the rising action, rising tension in the play. Then we have the inciting incident. And so this is where the story's problems really get set in motion. Now you might think it's, well, isn't that when the witches tell him that he's going to be the Thane of Cawdor and he's going to be the king? But that's not quite the case, because it's a decision that's made by the protagonist that sets the play in motion. He hasn't really done anything right now. He's just received information. So um, right after that scene, uh, they're at the king's palace, and the king says, "Hey, you're awesome. You did really well in battle. You're going to be rewarded." And then the king says, "Well, I'm going to name my successor." And then he names his own son, Malcolm. Now, To us that seems like, well, isn't that the way that it worked? But it's not. Back then in Scotland, it wasn't didn't go in that succession necessarily. So the king could have said Macbeth, and that would have been perfectly fine, but he didn't. He names his son. And Macbeth thinks maybe this is the moment that they're referring to. Maybe I'm going to become the king. And then he realizes, oh no, I'm not the king. So what the hell? I thought they said I was going to be king. He's upset. He writes to his wife, Lady Macbeth, and she reads the letter out loud. And then she has a monologue where she says, we need to be cruel, take matters into our own hands, essentially. But she fears Macbeth because he is too kind. Then Macbeth himself, arrives home and says, Duncan, the king, is on his way. He'll be here shortly. I ran ahead, or I rode ahead. And she says, well, he's never going to leave. He'll never leave this place alive. Um, and says to be a man, take action. And eventually he agrees to kill the king. And then he does it. It's that action that is the inciting incident in that play. That is the point of no return. It's an action that cannot be undone because he could have just left it all alone and done nothing. But it's that willful action on his part that makes it the inciting incident. Again, this is all part of the rising action, this series of events. Then we have the major crisis. Again, it's a decision by the protagonist, and it sends the play towards the final crisis. And so the example from Macbeth here is Macbeth, not only does he kill the king, so that's the inciting incident, he kills his best friend Banquo and tries to have Banquo's sons killed because remember, Banquo was told that his sons will be kings. And so Macbeth decides, well, let's get rid of that line so we don't have to worry about that. But Banquo's son Fleance gets away. Macbeth becomes king. He actually blames the Macduff, that's the previous king that Macbeth killed. He blames his sons for uh, for killing their father. They seem to have the most to gain, right? After all, he was just announced that he would be king. So if he kills his father, then he would be king. But he blames his sons. But the sons flee because they realize that something is afoot, and that they don't feel safe. One goes to England and one to Ireland. And so with them gone, Macbeth seems the next natural choice, so he becomes king. At a party to celebrate his crowning, the ghost of Banquet, it's at a banquet. The ghost of Banquo appears, and he is bloody. But only Macbeth can see Banquo, and he starts talking to Banquo in front of the dinner guests, and he admits to the killing. And his wife tries to stop him because he's making a scene. Um, and this really shakes him up. And so he decides to go back to the Weird Sisters or the witches again, because they've had this other premonition. And so he wants to get some clarity here. So he goes back and they tell him no one can harm Macbeth that's born of woman. Well, he figured, well, everyone is born of woman, so how could I possibly be harmed? I have nothing to fear. And then they say, don't worry, don't be afraid until Birnam Wood moves towards Dunsinane, the castle. Well, the wood is, if the castle's here, the wood is off over there. There's no way the wood is going to move toward the castle. That's not possible. And so he feels safe. And so he returns from the witches. And then someone tells Macbeth that Macduff is a nobleman and warrior, has left to England to speak with Malcolm. Malcolm is the previous king's son that has been named to be king. And Macduff is there to kind of get a measure of Malcolm, to see what he thinks. Macduff is not a fan of what's happening, the tyranny that's happening in Scotland under Macbeth's rule. Now, Macbeth finds out that Macduff is gone. And so he tells some people to go to the house of Macduff to kill his whole family, his servants, his kids. But Macduff isn't home, right? Macduff is off in England. And so that happens. Macduff's family gets slaughtered. While Macduff is speaking to Malcolm, the former prince, somebody comes and lets him know that your wife and children and servants have all been slaughtered. Uh, Up until that point, Macduff has not made a choice really which way to go. It seems that he's leaning one way, that he would rather Macbeth not be in charge of things, but he's still trying to get a measure of Malcolm. But once he hears this, the decision is made. He has to join Malcolm, and he commits himself to Malcolm, to propping up Malcolm as the next king. So he says he'll help, but to leave Macbeth to him. And so Malcolm has a whole bunch of, he's supported by the British, and so he has an army, and they go back to Scotland. So that is that decision to have Macduff's family killed is the major crisis that leads towards the climax. It is the decision that the protagonist, he's not a very good protagonist, but that the that Macbeth makes that cannot be undone, that leads to his undoing. And then, of course, um, we have uh, the climax, and the climax is the greatest point of tension. It changes the protagonist's fate, and there are twists. So these twists, as I mentioned, these are where we might expect something to happen, and then something else happens. And so in Macbeth, he gets word that the British and Malcolm are coming back to Scotland, but he recalls what the witches said. I can't be harmed by anybody that's been born of a woman, and I have nothing to fear until the wood comes towards the castle. So again, he feels safe. Um, all is well. Then someone comes out and says, "Hey, your wife, she has just committed suicide." Um, so he gets this bad news. And then another servant comes out and says, "Hey, I'm afraid to say this, but the trees from the forest are coming toward the castle." Uh, and Macbeth doesn't understand. But what, of course, have happened is the British and Malcolm has ordered them to chop down some trees and to hide themselves and to move toward the castle. So Macbeth starts to realize that those witches are being tricky and that he does have some things to fear. But it's all as well because he cannot be harmed by anyone born of woman. So the battle commences. Macbeth is doing really well. He's very successful, um, and in all the mayhem of battle. And so the climax occurs. So those are turns. Those are twists in the plot. But there's one final twist that lines up with the climax here. Macbeth comes upon Macduff. These Macduff is the other nobleman whom Macbeth had his family killed, and so they're about to fight, and Macbeth says, "Well, hey, I can't be harmed. I don't want to kill you. I can't be harmed by anyone that was born of woman." So, and Macduff says, "Well, I was from my mother's womb untimely ripped." In other words, his mother didn't bear him in that traditional way. He, it was a C-section, a cesarean section. So he was pulled from his mother's belly. And then Macbeth realizes, oh, I am undone. And they fight. And that's the climax. The thing is that Macbeth knows that he will lose, but he chooses to fight because he does not want to be paraded in front of people. He will die like a soldier. And so that is the decision that he makes. The decision that he makes, which is the climax, is that as opposed to running away or something like that, is that he chooses to fight even though he knows that he will die. So that's the climax. They fight. Um, and Macduff, that takes place off stage. Macduff comes back with his severed head and presents this to Malcolm. And then Malcolm invites all of the Lord. He has a very nice speech where he's trying to bring Scotland back together, and he invites all of the lords back to Scone to see him crowned, which is the resolution in the denouement there. And so we get a hint that under Malcolm's rule, that things will be much better in the speech that he has. And so that is the denouement. So I just wanted to give a clearer example of all of that. And let's see how some of that structure tracks in things like A Doll's House and other plays that we will read this term. And by the way, in terms of the point of attack for Macbeth, we talk about having early and late points of attack. So the late point of attack is if a whole bunch of information, a whole bunch of things have already transpired prior to the beginning of the play that affect the play. In the case of Macbeth, it's an early point of attack. Really, the things that transpire are the witches. And so that is an early point of attack. I wanted to pick up on Stanislavski. There was a lot of terms there, and you have access to those slides. We will be engaged in some of that material, and I will bring some of it up again, particularly given circumstances, objective, and obstacles. So we will come across that again and again. Another thing about theater is that, and it's a little bit unfortunate, is that there are multiple terms that mean the same thing. And so sometimes I will say, some people call it this, some people call it that. And the reason why I just think it's good to be exposed to that information because if I refer to it one way, you may either read elsewhere or come across through discussion with somebody else that, oh, they refer to it as that. When somebody says the essential action, they also mean the objective, etc. So I may introduce multiple terms. And the one thing that I wanted to pick up on, an analogy that Stanislavski uses when he talks about um, units, right? A unit is a portion of a scene over which an actor is playing a single objective. It makes it focused. They're wanting one thing over a particular duration of time. And so it can be really challenging if you see for an actor to have a play, a part, and to go in there, especially if it's a substantial role, and to say, oh, geez, I guess I just need to do it all at once. And um, Sometimes actors in Stanislavski's day, before kind of breaking things down into smaller units, would just rely on inspiration, right? And on old cliches and techniques. And so what he wanted to do was to say, no, no, hang on, let's make it manageable as opposed to trying to play the whole thing. Let's get really specific. So what do we want over this one unit, over this duration? And then, of course, and so I use the example in class that maybe there's a period where I'm trying to get somebody to, can you lend me your car or can I borrow money? And so I do that for a certain period. um, and we want that to be a high stakes situation. It needs to matter a lot, otherwise it ain't so interesting. And so Stanislavski also then breaks it down into those bits, right? That we play individual actions. We try different things, right? I may cajole, I may threaten, I may flatter, all in order to get somebody to lend me $1,000 or whatever the objective might be. So these are like little mini goals, little mini objectives. If my objective is to get somebody to lend me $1,000, well, I may say, "Oh, you look really good today." So I may flatter. Later on, I may lash out. You never do anything for me. So these are all little mini tactics that we try, and this is what we do in life too, that we try in order to achieve the overarching objective, which is to get them to lend me $1,000. And if I feel like I'm getting some traction from my scene partner, then I may continue to do other little tactics um, that are similar to that because it seems to be effective. And so we do that in life, and we also do that. We're going to need to do that when we're working on our monologues and scenes and when we're performing. And so those little things, those bits or beats, the smallest unit of action, um, is what we focus on moment to moment, right? I charm, I flatter, I entice, I threaten, etc., right? And we typically use verbs because they give us something really specific to do, as and all the examples that I just gave were verbs, often verbs that are done to someone. And so that's important that we are in relationship to another person, and everything that we are doing, 95, 98, 99% of what we're doing is to them in order to achieve the objective. So it becomes about relationship. And the analogy that Stanislavski uses is if you imagine that you have a turkey, you don't just eat the whole thing. You need to, and so that's how we may view a play. It's like, oh, there's the whole thing, and what am I gonna do? Um, well, you start to break it down. My apologies to any vegans and vegetarians, but you start to break it down. Well, here's the keel and or the breast, and here's the thigh, and here's the leg, and so that becomes a little more manageable. But then even when you look at that, if someone were to consume that, you're not going to put in the whole leg in your mouth. You're then going to take bit by bit or bite by bite, and that's the analogy that he uses. So I just wanted to pick up on that thread, and I'm going to end this section here, and I will do another one on the origins of theater.